Hi there. So this video is actually our last lecture in stabilization policies. And in this, I'm going to try to kind of summarize some of the modern theories in economics, where they might differ on what we should be doing for stabilization policy and kind of how they connect into the present day. And then finish with kind of an examination of where is economics going from here. We have another unit beyond this, but it's really kind of almost an extension idea of international trade and currency markets. So really, this kind of concludes the whole course in thinking about answering really our two central questions of how is the economy doing and what should we do about that? Like, depending on the answer to number one, what should we do about it? This is it. Like, this is as far as we've gotten in economics today. So I'm going to go through some of these. It's a little bit of a history lesson in some sense, but and take away from this that really the AP exam doesn't usually emphasize this information, with the exception of one point I'm going to mention. A lot of this stuff is more like for you to benefit from the idea of like, what's the big picture? What's the takeaway? So one of the schools of thought, and we say school here in the sense that it's a group of scholars who share beliefs, is called the Austrian School. And was born out of that man there. His name is F.A. Hayek, or Friedrich Hayek. He was Austrian. And in the 1920s and 30s, he was developing his economic theories right along the same time as Keynes was. And in many people's eyes of that era, they were kind of these polar opposite figures. Now, Hayek was nowhere near as famous as Keynes, and that's in large part because Hayek never really learned English very well. So his limited English capabilities really limited the ability of American and British and Canadian scholars to understand what his ideas were. But through his work in the 1940s, 50s, kind of became significantly more popular, particularly through popular authors like Ayn Rand, who I've put a photo of there as well. And in general, this is what they believe. They believe that, so kind of the scholars within this tradition would believe that the business cycle is really caused by asset bubbles, which means like, stocks have gotten overvalued or real estate got overvalued. When you think about things like the financial crisis in 2008, a lot of people would tie that to the housing market bubble. A lot of people tied the Great Depression to the stock market bubble of the 1920s, and to some extent a real estate bubble in the 1920s that also existed with Florida and some other places. And they basically said that all of this business cycle, the boom and bust cycle, is actually caused by these asset bubbles, and the asset bubbles are caused by government interventions. The government, by intervening in the market, basically by choosing kind of, we need to support this sector or this one, when they do things, they're creating the seed, they're sowing the seeds of the next recession when they intervene. And so the takeaway is that, in fact, we should avoid interventions and trying to manage the business cycle, because it actually typically generates worse results than not doing anything at all. And the issue here is really that it's not as politically feasible, right? I mean, kind of going back to like, it argues that we really shouldn't be doing stabilization policy. That the answer to that question is we shouldn't do it at all. Like, if the first question is the economy's not good or the economy's great, the second answer should be don't mess with it. If you're the government, stay out of it. It's a philosophical question as much as it is actually a practical question. So there's certainly a lot of people who would support the Austrian school or neo-Austrian school even today. The second kind of view is what we've presented in the course, which is probably more dominant in the orthodoxy of economics today, is some view of neo-Keynesianism. And again, Keynes himself, some of his ideas have been deprecated over the years. And I haven't really talked about that in this course, but certainly if you took econ and advanced further in college, you would hear about this. But that in short, their idea is that consumption and investment is the primary determinant of the amount of output in our long-run growth. That we need investment spending to stimulate capital goods formation, which creates more productivity and long-run growth, which we talked about that in this class. And that the amount of aggregate demand is really important, that consumption spending is where we need to focus our energy. So if we have a recession, it's probably caused by not enough spending. And so the government can step in and fill that gap, right? It's kind of this idea of your bucket is leaky, and the government could just fill some of that bucket. The idea here is that also to avoid the boom and bust in the asset bubbles that the Austrians talk about, we should use regulatory frameworks, regulations to prevent those things from happening. So we should regulate the financial industry so that they don't over speculate in certain things. Now, one of the problems with this is that often it leads to higher deficit spending. And there's a concern that it kind of normalizes deficit spending and creating debt. And there is certainly an argument within the Keynesian school of people who would say the debt doesn't really matter that much, or some people who say, yes, it does, and we should be much more cognizant in really good economic times of raising taxes, for example, to try to reduce the deficit during good times. And that's also stabilization policy. It's good policy to do that. Again, that's harder to do in practice, right? So a third school, and these are not necessarily all in opposite to each other, although the first two kind of are, it's called monetarism. And we haven't really spent a lot of time with this, but it's underlying actually our entire Unit 8. It's the idea that rather than thinking about aggregate demand being really important, it's actually saying that the money supply, and maybe to some extent aggregate supply, like that portion, is really important. And the aggregate demand can go up and down all day long, but aggregate supply, and particularly the money supply, has a really, really important aspect of this. So the two primary theorists here are Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman, and they are landmarks in economics. They are the giants of economics, right up there with somebody like Keynes and somebody like Hayek. They are considered extraordinarily important individuals. They kick off what we often call the supply side revolution and the monetarist revolution, which is really investigating how does aggregate supply work and thinking about how can we boost aggregate supply, and at the same time, how can we really think about the money supply as a part of that, with the monetary policy part of that. Those two developed after a really long and intensive research project about monetary history in the United States. They developed something called the quantity theory of money to explain actually inflation rates and the relationship of the money supply to inflation rates. So they basically said you have this M times V equals P times Y. And the terms basically mean the M is the money supply, the supply of money. And I'm going to rewrite the abbreviation. I know that that's silly, but I'm just using theirs. V is the money velocity. And this money velocity is kind of a quirky idea. That they basically said it's a constant. And I'll explain money velocity just briefly here, because you might see this on a test, on an AP exam. The AP exam has asked about this before. And money velocity is basically how many times a given average dollar is spent in a year, right? So it's like, how many times does it change hands? How speedy does it change hands? And so if you take the money supply, the total amount of money, and you multiply it by the average times that basically that dollar gets spent, then you get the total amount of GDP in the economy, right? The aggregate level of output times the price level. And so you get the equals, like if these are multiplied by each other, you get the price level in the economy, price level times the amount of nominal GDP. Now I'm noticing actually that this is the real GDP. So real GDP is just really like literally saying the total amount of output. And if you multiply these two together, this is actually just nominal GDP. Like that's when you take like the real GDP and you multiply it by the price level, you're taking away the real part again and you're just making it nominal. And what this tells us is that if you make the money supply bigger and there's a constant velocity of spending, that these basically, you're just going to boost the nominal GDP. And that in fact, that in the short run, this real GDP won't change very much because you've changed the supply of money. The amount of like output in the economy kind of just stays where it's at, which we talked about before, long run money neutrality. And that really that the end result is just boosting price levels. So if you can imagine kind of this as kind of a constant, or at least a very slow moving amount, right? Like if it changes, it only changes little bits, right? We often say that 2% is like a lot, right, with real GDP. So if 2% is a lot, then we can kind of almost say real GDP is kind of a constant. So if you double the amount of money and the money velocity is constant and the real GDP is relatively constant, you would see a doubling of prices. And so it's a nice explanation for why inflation happens, is why you boost the money supply, why prices will double in a proportional amount because of this equation that Schwartz and Friedman came up with. So it's a really kind of important observation about inflation and the relationship between the money supply with it. And so sometimes the AP test will throw it in as a multiple choice question. And they'll basically say, if the money velocity is constant and the real GDP is constant, or the aggregate output is constant, then what will happen if you increase the money supply? And you should just be able to kind of know, well, the price level goes up. I have seen them do something weird on the exam where they'll say the money supply stays the same, but the velocity doubles, which is weird because the velocity is not supposed to change, right? Their underlying equation of exchange assumed that it didn't, because it's just how many times the dollar gets spent in a year. But if your supply stays the same and velocity doubles, then you still end up with the same thing on the other side of the equation. So the implications here of monetarist theory is that really we don't need to use interventions of monetary and fiscal policy to address the business cycle. Instead, we just have to slowly increase the money supply to correspond to growth with potential GDP. So the monetarists and the Austrians kind of share some philosophical agreement that constantly intervening in the economy may not necessarily be a good thing. The downside of kind of the monetarists is that the money supply is actually not that easy to calculate. Like we in this class, we calculated it and I showed you, here's M0, bank reserves, M1, but the money supply, M2, is way bigger and it's way harder to calculate than it might seem. We actually used to have another measure of the money supply called M3 that was even bigger, and we just gave up on trying to calculate it because the amount of money flowing in and out of these accounts is enormous, and there's an enormous incentive of people to conceal it. So it's much more difficult for us to use this equation. The second feature is actually that the velocity of money has much slowed down. In a weird sense, since the 1990s, the velocity of dollars has decreased. There's research into why that is, but what it means is that the money supply changes may not always produce the same effect on this side that we might predict, right? So it kind of makes this equation a little bit more squishy. And it calls into question some of the assumptions of then, therefore, what we should do. That doesn't mean that it's wrong, right? None of these necessarily are wrong. They're normative differences. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is economics today a little bit. And I didn't put this on here, but there is kind of a modern consensus in economics. And even though it sounds like economists are always disagreeing about what we should do, generally speaking, they agree that you can use both fiscal and monetary to fight recessions. And in fact, I might even go farther and say most economists would say you should do that, particularly one or the other, right? Some economists would say you should use both, some should say use monetary, but really most modern economists say in a bad recession, you should do the stabilization. So the Austrians are there, but they're not the most common kind of out there. The second consensus is, can we use it to permanently reduce unemployment? And the answer to that is no, that like we can't really continually push down on unemployment, or else we're going to suffer some consequences. So even then, the economists would say, even the ones who are big into managing the economy would say our tools have limits. And the third is, how much should we manage it, right? How much should we try to smooth that business cycle? And that you've got a whole variety of answers about. That's where the argument is how much should we be using these tools and to what extent and in which ways, right? Now, some other things that are going on right now in econ. None of this is going to appear on the exam. So, and it won't appear on my test. It won't appear on the AP test. Feel free to turn me off, but this is some cool stuff. A lot of it has been focusing on using micro data to inform macro theories. It's called the micro revolution. And it really got kicked off in the 60s and 70s, and then it exploded in the 80s and 90s with people using data. A good example of that was in the 1990s. It was the first time that economists sat down and used data to analyze, do higher minimum wages yield more unemployment? Before the 1990s, economists had just said, well, in theory, yes, they do, and therefore they do. There was no empirical studies before the 1990s. That to me is mind-boggling. So really only in the last 25 years have we started saying, what's the real world tell us about the theories that we have? A second cool feature is these different study of issues. So there's a lot of research going on in labor markets and wages, minimum wages in particular. There's a lot of research about the impact of policy proposals. So lots of PhDs in economics right now being generated studying the pandemic policy responses, or the financial crisis in 2008 and how we responded to that. Did it work? How well did it work? There's a lot of research in international trade and international development, and why do certain countries grow and other ones don't? Lots of research on business cycles, and there's a whole field called business cycle theory, and we haven't gotten that good at it. So there's plenty of things for you, the young economist out there, to go and write a PhD about. The last thing, cutting edge stuff. the SOM rule. I encourage you to check this one out. It's kind of neat. She's an economist. She's on Twitter. She's great. Claudia SOM. And she developed this rule about the economy that is designed to predict recessions. And it's so interesting. I love it. Modern monetary theory is this whole, it's this kind of out there fringe theory, maybe fringe, maybe not, that's embraced by certain people that would say debt and deficits don't matter. And it's kind of interesting about it. So I'd encourage you to do some digging on that one. The blockchain, the whole idea of blockchain currencies, and the Fed right now is exploring how do we use the blockchain? Do we create a whole separate currency that's digital only? You know, Finland, for example, is experiencing with that sort of thing. Monopsony research is another cutting edge field as well, and studying like how do they work in real world scenarios. So I hope that through this class that you've gotten some exposure to some of these ideas and you say, yeah, that sounds cool. I'd like to study that. Note that economists and economics at the university level is very mathy. So you've got to be good with your math stuff to be able to work with all of this data and do some algorithms and write functions and things like that. But it's definitely stuff you can learn. So I think you've got the right tools in your toolkit. Anyways, I'll see you next time.